All right, today we're down in chapter 11, talking here about the subject that Paul has been talking about for the last two chapters. In chapters 9, 10, and 11, Paul is addressing a unique subject. It's a subject that if you just open your Bible to these chapters and begin reading, why you would say, what in the world is he talking about? You need to know the context to be able to put it together. And even when we know the context, then there's statements that are made in there that we say, I wonder what he means by this particular statement that he made. But now, let us remember this, that in the first 8 chapters of the book of Romans, Paul is teaching there, whether you are a Jew or a Gentile, you are going to be saved by faith as it is revealed in the gospel of Christ. And there is no difference between a Jew and a Gentile. Both are exactly equal under God. He looks at Jews and Gentiles as the same. You will be saved in the same way. Now, this was a perplexing question to the Jews at that time. It's not a perplexing question to you and me. We've been raised all of our life understanding and believing that. But put yourself back at that time. And all of those Jews, for the past 1,600 years, they and their fathers and grandfathers and all of the forefathers that had gone before them were raised understanding and believing that they were a spatially called people. Now, the fact is, they were a spatially called people. That God had called Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and then he had used Abraham's genealogy to bring in Christ. So they then looked at themselves as a very spatial people, and they were a very spatial people. God had given them the law and so forth, and so it just boggled their mind that after 1,600 years, in fact, after 2,000 years from the call of Abraham, somebody like Paul could come along and say, now there's no difference between a Jew and a Gentile. Just boggled their mind. They couldn't comprehend such a thing as that. Aren't we the children of Abraham? Aren't we the spatially called people of God? Aren't we somehow better than those Gentiles who have never been seeking God? They looked at the Gentiles as dogs. They wouldn't eat or drink or have any commerce with them. And now all of a sudden, here comes Paul on the scene, and he's preaching that Jesus is the Christ and that you Jews have missed him. You don't understand it. And now then, Jew and Gentile stand on the same ground. So it was a big question. How in the world could this be? So those people would come to the same conclusion as you and I would come to had we been living back there. Their first inclination was, maybe Paul hates the Jews. Maybe Paul doesn't like Jews, and therefore he is preaching against the Jewish nation. So Paul uses, these chapters to show, no, that is not the reason. He now is teaching in chapters 9, 10, and 11, here is the reason why Jews were rejected. Here's the reason why Jew and Gentile stand on the same level before God. Number one, it's not because I hate the Jews. And then he uses some argumentation. I myself am a Jew. I'm of this tribe and I'm of this, and so I am a Jew. And it is my prayer to God and my heart's desire that all the Jews would be saved. And so he shows them it's not because of any personal prejudice that I have, but there is a reason why, and he's dealing with this particular reason. Then the next question that they would think, now how could God do such a thing as this? Here it is, you go back 2,000 years ago, God chose Abraham, and he now has the Jewish nation, and all of a sudden, he is rejecting the Jewish nation. All of a sudden, there's no difference between a Jew and a Gentile. Now, why would God do such a thing as that? Did he just all of a sudden change his mind? Was he just capricious and without any reason just got mad? Kind of like we do sometimes if we've got a tool and we've been working with a tool and the tool doesn't work and we tried and finally you just take it and throw it in the trash basket. So I'm through trying that thing anymore. I'm going to go get me a new tool. Is that what God did? He just threw the Jews away? So that's what he's dealing with. Now, up to now, he has shown us, no, that is not what God did. God didn't cast off the Jews, but the Jews cast off God. You are the ones that actually threw God away. That's the point that he is making here. Now, here we start out here, and we can see in chapter 11, and last week we got down there to about the first 8 verses. But now he said, now God didn't cast off his people, they cast him off. And so as he goes ahead then in these first 8 verses, this is just review, in these 8 verses he says, I want you to understand this. There never was a time in history when the whole Jewish nation was really faithful to God. In every generation of the Jewish nation, from the time God called Abraham up to now, there were only a very few faithful Jews, and the rest of them were unfaithful. And he picks out one time. He shows the time. He said, you remember the time with Elijah? Elijah says they've all gone astray and they've killed all the prophets and now they're trying to kill me and I'm the only one that's left. And then God told him, no, out of this whole Jewish nation, I have 7,000, which is a very small percentage that's in there. So Paul then is making the point, today, over here, after Christ, in Christ, there is still a remnant of Jews that's made righteous by grace. So over here, since Christ established his church, saved by faith, Jews can still be saved, and Jews are still being saved. There are Jews being saved today, but any Jew that's saved today is not saved under the law of Moses, not saved by their perfect works, not saved because they're related to Abraham, but they're saved because of their faith. They obtain righteousness in the blood of Christ. And that's exactly the way the Gentiles are. So Paul then is telling that. Now, he says, now the nation of Israel rejected Christ. When they came to Christ, they just went around him. As a whole, now there were some Jews who accepted him. Remember, how many were there on the day of Pentecost? 3,000. Now, what percentage would that be, 3,000, out of approximately 4 million Jews? Right? What percentage? Just a very small percent. So as a nation, as a people, as a group, they rejected Jesus Christ then. So we go on then, it says, now God gave them up to a spirit of stupor. Now, we talked then last week that spirit of stupor means a way of thinking that's like a drunk individual. He said, now the Jews are thinking like somebody who is reeling and can't walk because he's had too much wine. You can't think clearly. Trying to show the Jews that's your problem. You can't really understand and you can't really think clearly in all of this. Now, I put this up to just show that is their history in there. And Moses had called them all together, and Moses had told them all of these things. And the Jewish nation had been stubborn, and they were not able to walk in God's ways really from the very beginning. We looked at Psalm 69. I'm not going to read that today. And then we looked at what Isaiah said again. And the reason we pick out these 2 verses is because Paul quotes them. These are the verses that Paul is talking about down here in verse 9. And so it says that they have a spirit of deep sleep, that you people are just walking in a spirit of drunkenness or stupor or a deep sleep. Now, here's where we begin today. These back here, he quotes David and Isaiah. Now, this is where we ended. And now today we're going to begin that over here, Jesus and Paul taught the same thing. He's telling the Jews, he says, now, when Jesus came, he had this to say about you, and Paul had this to say about you. And so we might look here at really what they had to say. We can see they said the same thing. When Jesus came, look what he said. It said, and he said unto them, this prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, by hearing ye shall hear, no wise understand, seeing ye shall see, and no wise perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross. your understanding, your mind. That's the heart, your mind. It has a coating of wax around it. Nothing penetrates you Jews. Well, why doesn't anything penetrate? Well, their ears are dull of hearing. Their eyes they have closed. So they can't hear with their ears. They've dulled them up. And they've closed their eyes. Nothing can penetrate their mind. Said that's the problem with the Jews. That's the problem with you guys. Then we have Paul coming along, and we can see how the Jews reacted. When Paul preached the gospel to them, it said, but when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with jealousy and contradicted the things which were spoken by Paul and blasphemed. Now I want you to note the word jealousy there, because we're going to come across that again. He's going to use that here in the Roman letter. When Paul was preaching, Paul was telling them about Jew and Gentile, and said the Jews were filled with jealousy, and so they contradicted, they argued with the thing about Paul. Now down there in red, Paul then finally says, seeing you thrust it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. Now, I want you to notice why Paul said, why did he turn to the Gentiles and bring in the Gentiles? Was it because God didn't love the Jews? Was it because Paul didn't like the Jews? No. It's because they judged themselves unworthy. When they heard the gospel truth, they rejected it. They were the judges. They were the one that made the decision. And he said, the decision you've made it your own. It's the invitation of God. He has asked everybody to come to him, but you've decided you're not going to do it. So you have made the decision. Another interesting thing is that later on, Paul and his workings there, he made this statement about people that believe lies and they can't see the truth. If you notice down there, it says, and that white up there, it says, because they receive not the love of the truth that they might be saved. Now there's a reason people aren't saved. It's because they don't have a love of truth. When they see the truth and it contradicts what they think, they take what they think over the truth. That's human nature. That's just human nature. We do that all the time. And it takes a real strong person to say, in any realm, doesn't make any difference what it is, I didn't think that was right. I'm wrong. That takes a big person. Now, what kind of person does that take? It takes a person who loves the truth. Somebody who loves the truth more than they love their own thinking and themselves. Now, he said, that's the reason people are not saved. And for this cause, God sendeth them a working of error, that they should believe a lie. So now, God sends them a working of error. This is interesting. How does God do it? A lot of times people say, well, God just arbitrarily, no. No, God sends them a working of error. God made you and me so that if we don't really love the truth, we will believe a lie because that's what we want to believe. Now, we've just gone through a period of time here where we can see this in our political arena. As you get in the political arena, Democrats and Republicans both have what they call talking points. And in those talking points, you probably heard people say, a guy would come on, and so he's going to uphold the Democrats or the Republicans. And they come on, and for that particular day, every person that came on, I say who was a Democrat, would say the same thing. It didn't make any difference what question was asked. They would say, well, and then they would start the same thing. See? And they'd say, well, wait just a minute, you didn't answer. Then they'd say the same thing. And so you look at it and you say, can't that person understand the question that they ask him? Because they're given a different answer. What is wrong? Well, the obvious answer is this. And this is known and everybody admits it, so it's not any secret. Every morning, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party would send out to all the people that's going to be on TV, all the people that are going to represent them, and say, here's what you cover today. Today, whatever you do when you go on TV, you come back to the war. And you say, I think the war should be, and you come back this. The next day, you get on the economy. Whatever the question is, but this failed economy that we have, whatever it is, and they all do that. Now, as you look at this, you see all these people, and it doesn't make a difference what you're trying to get at, what you're trying to study. They just blah, 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 this side, blah, 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 blah. And people out here say, what is wrong with politics? Well, what's wrong with them? They have a strong delusion. That is what is wrong. It doesn't make any difference what the truth is. You're not going to get it. Now, the same thing is true in religion. I have made up my mind, and I'm not going to change it. How many of you know Al Bass? Knew him. He's dead now. For those of you who know him, you'll enjoy this. He was a hard, firm old boy. He really loved the truth. But one time some people was trying to get him to go to Israel and said, Al, why don't you go to Israel? He had plenty of money and he could go. He said, I'm never going to Israel. He said, I already have it figured out in my mind what those places look like, and I don't want to get it confused. and so he didn't want to see what it really looked like and had to change. I'm happy with the way I am that's in here. Well, I suppose that's okay as far as going to Israel. But how many of us have the same thing in religion? I'm happy with where I am. You're not going to confuse me. This is it, regardless of what it says. Now, that's what Paul is saying that these Jews have that is in here, telling them that is your problem. Now we're down to where Paul says, now, did they stumble that they might fall? That's an interesting question down here that he's got. Did they stumble that they might fall? We've used the stumbling for time here. Stumbling is it's a stumbling block. It's a block right there just like that step that it's made so I can step up on it and I can raise myself higher. But what would happen if I came along? Now that step represents Jesus. That's the way he's a stepping stone. But I hit that and I fall. Now, you're out there talking. You'd say, why did Lowell miss that step? And somebody said, well, it's so he could fall. What would you think? That's dumb. No. I stumbled not because I wanted to fall so I could fall. I stumbled because I missed it. I didn't see it. And you say, why didn't you see it? I was blind. I wasn't looking. It was my fault. Now, this is what he's saying here. Did they stumble that they might fall? No. Now look at this. Back in Genesis 12:1, God told him, he said, Abraham, through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now that promise became the promise, the one promise that would carry on forever as long as this planet lasts. Now, who was this seed, through thy seed? We can skip over and we find it's Christ in Galatians 3:16. Paul just plainly says it is. He said that seed was Christ. Now, Christ was the stumbling block. Christ was a stumbling block. I've given you all those verses over there, Ephesians 2 and Matthew and so forth, to show that the Bible uses it in that way. That here it is, we've got this right here, this step. I'm down here, I'm a Jew. I'm coming along, walking along. Now I'm going to be raised up to where I should be. And here it is. Here's Jesus Christ there. Now, if I will accept that, step on him, come on up, I'm standing on Christ, everything will be fine. But if I'm here, and I'm a Jew, and I'm walking along, and I'm so proud of myself that I'm a Jew, and I am so happy about my bloodline, and I have the law, and then I hit that thing, and I fall. Then that's this thing here that is designed to help lift me up has now caused me to fall. Jesus Christ, who was designed by God to save mankind, became a stumbling block to the Jews because the Jews would not accept him. Now, I know that is true because the Bible tells me that. And as you can see there, I've got in Luke 20, it said, everyone that falleth on that stone shall be broken to pieces. Now, if you miss Christ, you Jews, you're going to be broken. But that's where the Jews went. The Jews went along until they got to Christ, and they could not accept Jesus as the Christ. That's when they fell. So that's the point that Paul is making here. But now, God used their fall as one more instrument for their salvation. Now, down in verses 11 through 15 is an interesting section. Now, think about how we pointed this out. How many things God has used as instruments for the salvation, of mankind. Now then, he's even going to use the fall of the Jews. He's going to use that as another instrument in here in this. And he's going to work on the subject of jealousy. He's going to use jealousy in here and there. Now, over in the red, I got Acts 9, Galatians 2. Both of those verses there say that God chose Paul to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Now, if you go back and you think, okay, what would the Jews have thought about that? When God called Paul, who was a Jew that was of great prominence in Jerusalem, great prominence among the Sanhedrin, and he said, now I'm going to send you out to preach to the Gentiles. That's going to cause some jealousy among the Jews. Why not us? Why are you sending him out to preach to those inferior people? God's going to use that jealousy to try to provoke the Jews to come back to him. You see, jealousy can be used in two different ways. If I'm really ugly to my wife, and all of a sudden I see that somebody else is giving her a lot of attention, and that she enjoys getting that male attention, that's going to make me jealous. And I can do one of the two things. I can either change my ornery ways, and I can start being nice to her to try to say, here, honey, look at me, to try to draw her to me, or I can get mad at her and yell and scream and make it worse. But now jealousy can be a good thing, and it can be the thing that'll hit me in the head and bring me back. Now, let's see what the jealousy of the Jews did. Paul, when he went back to Jerusalem, and he said unto them, this is a Jewish audience, depart, or this is God talking to Paul. He said in there, and Paul is telling this to his Jewish audience. He's saying, now here's what God said. He said, depart, for I will send thee forth far hence unto the Gentiles. Now, Paul tells the Jews this. Now, they'd been listening to Paul up until this word. When he used that naughty word. What was the naughtiest, most immoral word you could use in talking to a Jewish audience? Gentile. Gentile. Now, he sent me to the Gentiles. And they lifted up their voice and said, away with such a fellow from the earth. It's not fit that he should live. And they cried out and threw off their garments and cast them into the air. In other words, they just went berserk when he mentioned the Gentiles. Now, that should have provoked them the other way. That should have provoked them to where they say, well, if God's going to call the Gentiles, what about us? What about us people who he's called all this period of time? The nation who has been his nation. But it didn't work there. So now he's going to show in this next section about how the Gentiles, how the Jews were a special people, and what you could do with them. Now, I'm going to kind of show you the picture here, and then we're going to read the verses. He's going to have a picture here, going to draw a picture about a tree. And here you have a tree in here, and in this tree, the Jews were the natural branches. Abraham down here is the root. Up here you have this trunk that comes up. It's a holy trunk. And the branches that come off of it, they're also holy, and they were the Jews. The Jews were the offspring of Abraham. But now then, he's going to show in here that all of a sudden, some of those Jews wouldn't believe in Jesus Christ, and because of their unbelief, God cut them off. Now, why were they cut off from the tree? Because of their unbelief. Because when they looked at what God did, they didn't see Christ. They wouldn't accept Christ. So they're cut off. They're going to be cut off. And here's some more Jews, almost the whole nation. Because of their unbelief, and so they're cut off. So here now you have the lineage. You have Abraham. Have the stem coming up, which is a holy stem. And now then, all of a sudden, God says, now I'll graft the Gentiles in. So I now am going to go out in the woods and get another branch, bring this branch in, and I'll graft them in. Now why? Because of their faith. There's a reason why God cast off the Gentile or the Jews. In fact, He didn't cast them off; they cast themselves off because of unbelief. The Gentiles had faith, and so they were grafted in. Now then, the Gentiles, He's going to warn us. Now, before you get too cocky and you think, see how much better we are than the Jews? God cut off the Jews, and He grafted in us Gentiles. See how good we are? See how great we are? Now, can Gentiles have the same attitude that the Jews had? Yeah. Now, He said, lest you do that, God can also cut you off. So I want you to know that. God can cast you off, and then if those Jews over there turn from their unbelief and they have faith here, then the Jews can also be grafted back into this tree, back in here again. So God now, if He could graft in a Gentile, He can graft the Jews back in, and now you have the Jews with faith. And now you have this tree, the children of Abraham, coming up, Jews or Gentiles. It all depends on faith. That's what the whole thing depends on. So now that's what he's going to be talking about. So now then, let's read this, and I think it'll help us to understand here as we start out now in verse 11. I say then, did they stumble that they might fall? God forbid. The answer is no. But by their fall, salvation is come to the Gentiles. Since the Jews fell away, God has invited the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. He's trying to provoke the Jews to jealousy to come back. Now, if their fall is the riches of the world, and their loss the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Now, when the Jews fell, if that turned out to be a great blessing to the rest of the world, what would it be if the Jews would turn around and come back again? Just think how wonderful that would be. 13. But I speak to you that are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I glorify my ministry. So I said, now I'm talking now about as an apostle to the Gentiles to glorify my ministry. If by any means I may provoke to jealousy them that are of my flesh and may save some of them. So I'm trying to make them jealous, just like my wife might try to make me jealous, to provoke me to change my ugly attitude. So he said, I'm trying to provoke them to jealous. For if the casting away of them is the reconciling of the world, what shall be the receiving of them but life from the dead? So if when they fell away, if that turned out to be good for the salvation of the world, what would it be if they'd turn around and come back again? And you had thousands of believing Jews. And if the first fruit is dead, and if the first fruit is holy, I'm messing it here. And if the first fruit is holy, so is the lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. So he's saying now Abraham is a holy man and comes up, and the branches also are holy. And if some of the branches were broken off, that's the Jews, and thou being a wild olive, now this is the Gentiles, you're the wild limb. Now, and being a wild olive, was grafted in among them, and didst become partakers with them of the root of the fatness of the olive tree, glory not over the branches. If thou gloriest, it is not thou that bearest the root, but the root thee. So now he's beginning to warn the Gentiles. Don't you Gentiles get the same cocky attitude that the Jews had. God cut them off because of their attitude, thinking they were so great, and they missed salvation. And now then, if the Gentiles get cocky, just have the same attitude, he'll cut you off the same way he cut them off. So he says, 19, but thou wilt say, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, by their unbelief are they broken off. So I said, now you Gentiles might say, look how great we Gentiles are. God cut those Jews off so he could graft us in. Not so. Nope. The reason those branches were broken off is because of their unbelief, because of their lack of faith, because the Gentiles would not believe. Well, by their unbelief were they broken off, and thou standest by thy faith. It all depends on your faith. That's the key, see? Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. Be not high-minded, but fear. Still talking to the Gentiles. Now you fear when you think about this. For if God spared not the natural branches, neither will he spare thee. Now if he cut off those branches just natural because of unbelief, what do you think he'll do to you, who's not a natural branch, but you're a grafted in branch? What do you think he'll do to you if you've got unbelief? So then he exhorts them, behold then the goodness and severity of God. Toward them that fail severity, but toward thee God's goodness, if thou continuest in his goodness, otherwise thou shalt also be cut off. So now, he said, think about this. Can't you see the goodness and severity in God? That God showed his severity when he cuts off the Jews because of unbelief. He shows his goodness when he brought in you unnatural branches, Gentiles, because of your belief. It all depends on the severity and goodness of God. It doesn't depend on what you think. It depends on your faith. God acts on the basis of your faith then. He says in 23, and they also, if they continue not in their unbelief, shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. So, if a Jew out here, a limb, if this Jew believes in Christ, he can be put back in. So there's no difference between a Jew and a Gentile. That's his whole point that he's trying to make in here. 24. For if thou wast cut out of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, and was grafted in contrary to nature, a good olive tree, how much more shall those which are of the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? So if you Gentiles, who is not a natural branch, could be grafted into this lineage of Abraham, how much could a believing Jew over here be grafted back in again? So the whole point that he's making down to this point is faith. Faith. Jew or Gentile. Faith. And now in this particular chapter, that's what he taught in the first 8 chapters, but in this particular chapter he's showing again. Now, how are you going to be saved? By faith. Why were the Gentiles the Jews cut off? Lack of faith. Why were the Gentiles brought in? Because of faith. Can Jews be saved? Yep. How? By faith. So if a Jew has faith, he can be grafted in. Gentile has faith, he can be grafted in. If you lose your faith, you'll be cut off. The whole thing depends upon your faith. behold the goodness and severity of God. Okay, that's where we're closed today.